We would like to acknowledge that we are gathering on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. We want to pay respect to the citizens of the Kumeyaay Nation, both past and present, and their continuing relationship to their ancestral lands. And now for a little bit of context for this week's Afterlives panel focused on mourning and continuing bonds. If we live long enough, we will experience the death of a loved one and the grief that follows. We may even participate in a mourning ritual or a practice to mark the death of a family member or friend. And we may engage in certain types of communication that maintains bonds with the deceased. But what is the difference between grief, mourning, and continuing bonds? So in preparation for the next, 45 minutes or something like that, we'll spend together during this session, we wanted to offer some definitions of these concepts. And so this is a collaborative document here. Grief and mourning are frequently used interchangeably, but at least for academics, they're two different ideas. First, grief is a psychological response, that kind of shock or sadness that we may experience to a loss or a death. Grief is a natural reaction to any kind of loss, not necessarily death, and can be experienced temporarily or can last a long period of time. Research indicates that some people even experience grief in the days, months, years that lead up to a death, and that's called anticipatory grief. So now that we have a definition of grief, we want to talk a little bit about mourning. These are the rituals and practices that people engage following the death that are often public. Funerals, memorial services should probably come to mind. They can be social, communal, or individual, but there are so many other customs and practices that demonstrate how communities make particular choices about remembering the dead and remaining bonded to them. And they're, again, often public expressions of grief. If you have visited the Dia de los Muertos altar, you've seen one of those examples. Continuing bonds is the idea that bereaved people do not sever ties to effectively navigate their grief. It's not required to navigate their grief. But they can continue to connect with memories of the dead and maintain a relationship with deceased loved ones, hence continue the bond between the living and the dead. So with these definitions in mind, let's begin with Dr. Mena, who will discuss ancient religious practices of mourning, continuing bonds.
I want to start by thanking Dr. Clack for the invitation to join you all today, as well as thank my co-panelists for what has already started to be, I think, a great conversation, at least so far amongst the three of us, but inviting you all to join in as well. Before I begin, I want to say something first. I think what I'm going to talk about is slightly different. I'm going to focus more on that aspect of continuing bonds. And I'm going to say quite a bit about something that is called new materialism. And that's just my way of signaling to all of you that I'm going to sort of move through some very boring pieces, but I hope it won't be too boring. And I brought slides just in case so that you can follow along. Okay. We've had recently a series of events on campus and in this very room that looked closely at a celebration known as Dia de Muertos. Throughout the series of different events, there was a lot of teaching and learning centered on the many customs and beliefs of predominantly Mexican people and people of Mexican descent, but also many other Chicanx and Latinx people around the world. While there's much nuance and complexity around Dia de Muertos practices, I want to simply note that the practices and customs that signal a celebration of the dead is often regarded and looked at with varying degrees of suspicion or aversion by those for whom these practices are not customary. And often the narrative of how these practices, such as altar making, there's an altar in the back for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, or beliefs that there are continuing bonds between this plane of existence and some other plane where our loved ones have passed on to, is often explained as a commingling of spiritual worldviews. In other words, we are often taught that these practices come with the imposition of Catholic Christianity into the spiritual lives of indigenous worldviews in the 16th and 17th centuries. Santeria and voodoo are often cited as other similar examples where Catholic Christianity was unable to restrict the spiritual lifelines of indigenous spiritualities enough so that these practices would be obliterated. And instead, a third hybrid category of spiritual beliefs and practices is produced. This third hybrid category can be romanticized, capitalized, even monetized, or rejected as not real religion, or even relegated as the remnants of non-Christian spirituality. And so here are just two very basic and probably obvious examples. In other words, many people have seen this, the movie Coco, which I love and my students will watch. But again, it's a way of capitalizing on a certain kind of idea. Voodoo donuts, I just actually returned from Portland, where all my friends from the Pacific Northwest said, do not go there. So I didn't go there. But I do have an image of these donuts. They're supposed to be fantastic and horrifically expensive. I want instead to complicate this narrative. In part, I want to demonstrate how Christians, from some of their earliest traditions, understood the world in similar ways that these practices gesture towards. That is, some Christians had a worldview in which this real material world was separated by what Roman historian Peter Brown calls a thin veil to some otherworldly, no less real plane of existence in which our ancestors gather after their human lives have ceased to exist. And this image from the movie, I think, is a great sort of image of that, right? This mingling together of past and present. In fact, but often not regarded as something that is part of ancient Christian practices, which is what I'm trying to argue. In fact, ancient Christians cultivated particular practices that ensured this connection between the living and the dead would persist, not simply during the lifetimes of their loved ones, but for generations, centuries, millennia even, as is evidenced by the practices of preserving the relics of saints. Relics are revered material fragments, clothes, bones, hair, teeth, belonging to a person who is remembered through these same fragments. So I want to begin and actually spend most of my time this afternoon talking about and perhaps introducing some of you to a way of thinking about things, or rather the thingliness of things. And by that I mean attuning ourselves to the material. This way of thinking has been coined new materialisms in scholarly discourses. And they help me articulate a way of viewing the world that may have been more present in more ancient times, and that might also help us sense not only what ancient Christians were up to when they created these continuing bonds through relics, but also what some contemporary Christians are up to when they participate in similar practices that preserve our connections to people and loved ones no longer present in this reality. So again, first, some discussion about new materialisms. I'm going to talk about some of the work in new materialist thought, and although I know that it's not always great to put big chunks with big quotes up on screen, I'm actually going to do exactly that. I think it will be helpful as I read these sort of large block quotes for you to follow along with what it is that I'm saying. In their work on new materialisms, Mel Chen describes their work using the term animacies. They define the term as that which has, quote, been described variously as a quality of agency, awareness, mobility, and liveness. They describe the term's contents and contestations and go on to say, using animacy as a central construct rather than, say, life or liveliness, though these remain a critical part of the conversation, helps us theorize current anxieties around the production of humanness in contemporary times, particularly with regard to humanities' partners in definitional crime, animality as its analog or limit, nationality, race, security, environment, and sexuality. Animacy activates new theoretical formations that trouble and undo stubborn binary systems of difference, including dynamism, stasis, life, death, subject, object, speech, non-speech, human, animal, natural body, cyborg. In its more sensitive figurations, animacy has the capacity to rewrite conditions of intimacy engendering different communalisms and revising biopolitical spheres, or at least how we might theorize them. And it's actually that last piece down there, and it's more sensitive figurations. Animacy has the capacity to rewrite conditions of intimacy that I really am sort of leaning into with this new materialist thought and how these continuing bonds are forged. According to Chen, a consideration of animacy gets at undermining problematic binaries in the service of opening up the capacity to speak of non-human matter in terms that better capture its relationship with or affect on all human and non-human matter. To be sure, Chen's theories on animacy contribute to the ever-growing work in theories of affect. I offer a brief example to better understand the contributions of new materialist thinking. Anthropologist Bruno Latour describes the now well-known dictum of the National Rifle Association: guns don't kill people, people kill people, right? This is a phrase probably many of us are familiar with. But as Sonia Hazard has described in her article, The Material Turn in the Study of Religion, Latour's work shows the falseness of this maxim by suggesting that once a person picks up a gun, they have been affectively changed and are no longer exactly the same person they once were. Hazard writes, guns, among other things, when connected with humans, make up new networks or assemblages that embolden or enable certain kinds of actions, specifically killing. One would not use the barrel of a gun to arrange a bouquet of roses, after all. A shared human recognition of the gun's violent potential, drawn from, say, the news and films, induces an affective reaction on the part of the holder, who might feel powerful and dangerous. The physical heft of the gun and the contours and textures of its surfaces may reinforce such feelings and accentuate an inclination to violence. Its trigger, which is shaped to accommodate a finger, directs human activation of a bullet. And, of course, the speed of the bullet enables a murder far more easily than if one set out to kill with his or her bare hands. According to Latour, when a person kills with a gun, it is not only the person who kills, it is the larger assemblage that kills. Its murderous agency is distributed across its many parts, including a finger, a trigger, a bullet, a human brain, violent films, and so on. Agency is always complex agency, unlocalizable and distributed across assemblages of both humans and things. So again, this is Hazard's way of looking at this anthropologist's work and suggesting that material or inanimate or objects that we tend to think of as not having animacy or having the ability to affect things is actually false. So the gun is probably one of the more potent symbols of how an object that we think of as inanimate changes or can change the way a person behaves or moves through the world. Hazard and others use the term assemblages from Deleuze and Guattari, two other scholars, two other thinkers, theorists, in order to describe the entangled network of relations between things, subjects, and objects that work in tandem, affecting each other. Working in unison as part of an assemblage, or apart as plugged into other assemblages. The point being that as a component of an assemblage, each part is equally important and therefore decentering the human as either the subject for analysis or the component upon which other lesser components act upon. Furthermore, Chen highlights the way that hierarchies of animacy further undermine the project of new materialist thinking. She uses linguistic theories to get at this problem and thereby suggests the important implication of new materialist thought. They write, consider the phrase, the hikers that rocks crush. Okay, it's a very strange sounding phrase, or should be. What does this mean? The difficulty frequently experienced by English speakers in processing this phrase has much to do with the inanimacy of the rock, which plays an agent role in relation to the verb crush, as compared to the animacy of the hikers, who in this scenario play an object role. The hikers that rocks crush thus violates a cross-linguistic preference amongst speakers. Yet more contentious examples belie the apparent obviousness of this hierarchy, and even in this case, it is within a specific cosmology that stones so obviously lack agency, or could be the source of causality. What if non-human animals or humans stereotyped as passive, such as people with cognitive or physical disabilities, enter the calculus of animacy? What happens then? Chen's provocative question alludes to what the stakes are for new materialist paradigms. I will conclude by returning to ancient Christianity. And in her book, The Corporeal Imagination, Patricia Cox Miller considers the range of options for ancient writers to communicate their own turn to the material in late antiquity. For Miller, Christians of the late Roman and early Byzantine worlds attempted to make meaning of their world by relying on what she has termed the corporeal imagination. According to Miller, Christians imagined matter, and for her purposes, most explicitly bodily matter, as sites for the elaboration of spiritual presence, power, and activity. Miller highlights a variety of ways in which Christian authors in late antiquity turned their focus to bodily matter and attempted to articulate the human body in art, literature, architecture, and other cultural artifacts. Miller relies on thing theory, exemplified by the work of Bill Brown. Brown, borrowing from Heidegger's distinctions between objects and things, posited that an object becomes a thing once it ceases to function as its intended purpose. And the best example of this is a window, or a dirty window rather. So if we think about, well, we don't really think about windows. Windows are sort of a conduit to the outside, right? And so we turn towards a window really to look past the glass and whatever makes it up to actually see what's on the other side of that. We don't actually think of the window as a thing until it fails to do what it's supposed to do, which is to allow us access to looking outside. So a dirty window, for example, has now interrupted the window's functionality, and we now can conceive of the window as a thing, an object that actually needs to be cleaned in order for it to continue serving its purpose. But more often than not, we don't actually think of the window, we just look through the window. And this is an example that Bill Brown uses in describing their thing theory. At the moment an object fails to function as it's supposed to, the relationship between the object and the human changes. Miller argues that Christians from the 4th through 6th centuries developed strategies for articulating the saintly body post-mortem as more than just matter, but also a conduit for the divine. So her work focuses on relics, I think I have them here again, hagiographies, and icons. In doing so, Miller argues that Christians retained the body, wrote the body, and depicted the body as more than just matter. These strategies, according to Miller, require the development of interpretive finesse so that the excess, the surplus value of things, could be engaged and celebrated in non-idolatrous fashion. While Miller's work doubly signals a turn to the material, first in her scholarship and as a methodology for considering Christianity in late antiquity, in her analysis of the Christian authors who attempted to make meaning out of bodily matter, the corporeal imagination still hinges on bodily matter, and therefore in many ways continues to center the human as the point of reference for analysis. Now, but all of this materialist thinking in mind, I'm going to return to these relics and something that Peter Brown, someone I mentioned earlier, has said. Peter Brown wrote about ancient Christians, quote, "For compared with Christian piety of later ages, the early church tended to leapfrog the grave. The long process of mourning and slow adjustment to the great sadness of mortality tended to be repressed by heady belief in the afterlife. The gleaming white shrouds, the incense, the strict control of demonstrations of grief were a triumphal reminder of Christ's triumph over death." He goes on to cite an example of late Roman Christian cemeteries that identify graves as spacious gardens of paradise. And so I want to finish by suggesting that attuning our thinking to the material, thinking of non-human matter differently and with some varying degrees of animacies, helps us render an understanding of intimacy, right? The kind of intimacy that Chen suggests we might strive for. Intimacy that is otherwise inhibited by our current cultural ways of thinking about death, about bodies, and about the preservation of our connections to things, humans and non-humans alike, once they cease to exist. This kind of thinking not only helps us see how contemporary religious practices work toward reinforcing these bonds, but also how these practices and ways of viewing the world are not so new nor so strange. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm also kind of not talking specifically about mourning and continuing bonds in a sense, but my topic, like it says, is focused on the experience of grief associated with physician-assisted death. And so what I want to first start by doing is just going over what is physician-assisted death, because I think people have a lot of misunderstandings about the programs. They are relatively new in most states in the United States. I'm going to focus primarily on Oregon, which is the state that has had a death with dignity law for the longest in the United States. So that's where most of the research comes from. But the programs that have been adopted in other states are roughly similar. So what I want to focus on for my talk to kind of bring it together to look at sort of dealing with death and then the continuation of bonds is focusing primarily on some of the concerns that people have about why we should not have these programs. And then because I'm a psychologist from psychological sciences, I will tell you about what the research evidence says related to some of these misunderstandings. And one of the things that I want to focus on primarily towards the end is looking at how do family members respond when one of their loved ones is a participant in the program. So Oregon, like I said, is the first state in the United States that adopted legislation allowing for physician-assisted death. So historically, people referred to it as physician-assisted suicide, and you'll still hear that terminology sometimes, but people have sort of moved away from that because the idea is that suicide is something that's associated oftentimes with psychological illness, and it's oftentimes construed as an irrational act. But physician-assisted death, or as it's more commonly called now, medical aid in dying, is a program that's designed to give people near death back some of their agency. And then the switch from physician-assisted death or dying to medical aid in dying is also giving agency back to the patient, the individual who's suffering. So it's not so much that the physician is in control, although they are the clearinghouse to get access to the medication. It's recognizing that the individual is maintaining control over their experience with death. So the programs in the United States all have rough similarities. So in Oregon, the programming is that you have to be at least 18 years of age, you have to be a legal resident of the state, and then you also need to be mentally competent in order to make a decision. The participant needs to be independently diagnosed by 2 physicians as having a terminal illness, which for the purposes of the program is anticipated 6 months or less left in terms of time to live. They also need to make requests multiple times. So there needs to be 2 verbal requests separated by at least 15 days, and then a written request that's notarized by someone else. And so in the US, there was actually a significant delay between enacting new legislation from the time that Oregon's law passed. Initial legislation delayed it from 1994 to implementation in 1997. And then there was a Supreme Court case in 2006 related to the Oregon legislation. And after the Supreme Court said that there was nothing wrong with the law, other states started to adopt it. And so now currently in the United States, 10 different locales offer some form of a death with dignity statute. Montana actually doesn't have a statute. Their Supreme Court upheld physician-assisted dying. But lots of the states that appear on this list enacted legislation from 2015 on. So it's become something that is a little bit more common. And so I just want to note here that this is very different from something like euthanasia, which is illegal in the United States. Euthanasia would be where someone goes in and administers lethal medication. In a medical aid in dying situation, the patient obtains a prescription from a physician, fills the prescription, and then there's two different formats. One of them is injection, one of them is ingesting medication, but the patient decides independently whether or not they're going to take the medication or give the injection. And the design is that it is self-administered. So just to look at some of the data so we have a feel for how frequently these types of deaths are occurring, one of the things that you can see here is that from 1998 up to 2018, the participation in the program has significantly increased. But one of the things that's held rather steady across the years is that there are more people who get prescriptions than actually use the prescriptions. And that's one of the things that I'll address in a little bit. So all states that have this type of law enacted have reporting agencies that collect the data. Oregon has very, very clear, easily accessible data. So if you're interested in sort of learning more about it, I have the website down there at the bottom. Okay, so some primary issues of concern, and you may be familiar with some of these arguments. They're still brought up presently. But so one of them has to do with how do we know that this is what the patient actually desires, right? Because we oftentimes exist in a very paternalistic environment where other people know better than an individual what's good for them. And one of the things that I did not say was that a psychiatric evaluation was required for participation in the program. So people oftentimes argued that only depressed people would want to participate in these programs. Psychiatric evaluation can be ordered by a physician in the event that they believe that the patient is suffering from psychological illness, but it is not a requirement. One of the things that individuals have argued is that people who are more vulnerable, so marginalized groups, low-income groups, might be pressured to take their own lives as they become more of a burden on the system. I'll talk about research on that issue as well. And then the last thing that people have argued in terms of just general response is that implementing these programs serves as a barrier to providing more effective palliative care. And so palliative care is a term that's used loosely to sort of describe a wide variety of programming that's in place designed to reduce patient suffering. It oftentimes is focused on pain relief and designed to deal with both physical and psychological suffering, so helping clients deal with stress and anxiety as well. So related to grief, one of the issues that people have argued is we know that there are negative consequences for surviving individuals in instances of suicide. So oftentimes survivors experience things like shame or guilt or a sense of rejection following the suicide of a loved individual. And researchers have looked specifically at the issue of what's the experience of grief for individuals whose family members participate in these programs. And so like Julian said at the beginning, grief is a normal response to losses of any kind, and in particular it can occur in response to death. So it's something that can be relatively short-lived or long-lasting. In the literature, researchers used to use the term complicated grief to refer to clinical grief-related syndrome. So this was typically considered to be grief that lasted longer than 6 months and was interfering with your ability to function. So experiencing disruptive yearning where you can't think about anything other than wishing that the lost individual was still present, associated with some symptoms similar to depression, a sense of hopelessness, disengagement from general life. And so one of the things that we might want to consider then is there consequences and increased risk of experiencing complicated grief, or the new term, right? Psychologists need to change terms all the time so we stay relevant, is now prolonged grief disorder. But is that potentially something that is an issue associated with participation? So I will speak to each one of these things in turn based off of what the research evidence actually shows. So first thing is that desire to participate in these types of programs is relatively low. So many wide-scale surveys of patients who have been diagnosed with terminal illness in the context here of having 6 months left to live or less, roughly 10% of them report even thinking about it. And then people who actively discuss it, which is an indicator of potential interest in participation, is 3% of that underlying sample. And pretty consistently across studies, about 1.5%, 2% of individuals actually have a discussion with their physician about participation. So it's not something that once the laws became enacted, now all of a sudden all these people are seeking to end their lives. And then what was interesting is that several studies have looked at the way that people might change their mind. So one of the things that's an indicator that people change their minds is the data that I showed you about the difference between getting the prescription and actually taking the prescription. In some cases, what happens is that people, by the time they get the prescription and fill it, they're no longer capable of self-administering. And if someone else administers, they're potentially liable under several different legal statutes. So that's one of the issues. But the gap is in part by virtue of the fact that people sometimes change their minds. But when we say change their minds, we're not necessarily talking about somebody who's no longer interested in having this option. It's just they're no longer enacting that option. So in this one study, I know it seems weird because it says that people change their mind over the course of a year, but in this study, they talked to physicians, family members, and patients. And so for the family members, sometimes they reported that the individual who subsequently died had indicated some changing their mind. But the research evidence suggested that people shifted from being interested in actively participating to not, and vice versa, to feeling like, no, this program is not for me, to changing their mind, to then becoming interested in it. So there was a study that looked at the risk to vulnerable groups. So they specifically looked at elderly individuals, individuals with stigmatized illnesses such as AIDS, individuals from low socioeconomic status groups, individuals that were uninsured in both Oregon and the Netherlands. So the Netherlands actually has both physician-assisted death programming, and euthanasia is legal under their current code. But the evidence from that study indicated that there was zero elevated risk for vulnerable populations, so it wasn't the case that people were being pressured to participate in the program when they didn't desire to. And then several studies have illustrated that if patients show signs of depression or other psychological disorders, their requests are significantly more likely to be denied by physicians. So by and large, the kind of initial considerations about this opening up the door for people to be pressured to take their own lives hasn't manifested itself. So one of the things that I mentioned was that people also argue that having these types of programs serve as an impediment to developing palliative care programming. And if you look at the reasons why people report wanting to be participants in a medical aid in dying program, the number one variable that stands out is not pain. So if you look at this graph here, the gray bars represent what the researchers are calling something that's a condition or value, whereas the white bars are representing strictly a physical symptom. So palliative care is designed primarily to deal with physical symptoms, although there is some focus on psychological distress. But the idea is that the reason why people oftentimes report desiring to participate in these programs is because they want control. They want to have a determination over the way that their life ends. And so what I want to highlight for you is that this data is coming from physicians. So physicians were asked to indicate their impression of the reasons why patients were interested in participating in the program. And so we know that someone's impression of what's happening may not be consistent with how the person actually feels, but we have data that's coming from family members and program participants that shows roughly the same thing. So I apologize, this graph is not the most easy to read, but I just wanted to put it in here because what you can see is that they're looking at historical cases, which in this case means an individual that actually went through the program and did end up taking the medication to end their own life. Ongoing cases is individuals that are actively seeking to participate in the program. And so the historical cases, they asked family members, in your impression, what were some of the reasons why the individual that you care about sought to hasten their death? And in the ongoing cases, they're talking to patients. So what you can see is that, again, pain, which is right here, is not one of the primary variables that's being reported. Again, what you see is that people are seeking to remove themselves from a situation that is promoting general suffering, an inability to sort of live life in the way that they want to, and they want to gain back control. So the idea is that palliative care is addressing something that these medical aid in dying programs are not. So it's not serving as a barrier to creating new, improved palliative care situations. The same type of individuals that seek one service may or may not be seeking another type of service. So then, speaking about grief, one of the things that we know is that unanticipated loss can create significantly greater problems for processing it, coming to terms with it, moving forward with acceptance than an anticipated loss. And so one of the things that I've mentioned is if you look at the data about why people want to participate in a medical aid in dying program, it's because they tend to be individuals that want control. And both family members and physicians have reported that individuals who seek out this programming tend to be very, very high on the independence side of the scale, right? And so this is something that allows them to, in the end of life, live out a life-related value. So that's one of the things that can potentially then help family members come to terms with it, is knowing that this family member was able to deal with a situation in a manner that's consistent with their strongly held values. Early work suggested that family member responses were a little bit mixed in terms of being supportive, but newer data that's looked at participation in the programs in the last 10 years has suggested that family members tend to be relatively supportive, recognizing that this is a situation that the particular participant wanted. So the value of these types of programs is that they promote discussion. And so interviews with physicians, family members, and program participants have all indicated that when the topic comes up, it prompts significant discussion with loved ones and the family member about why do they want to participate in this program? What are the consequences of participating in this program? And the more discussion leads individuals to be in a position where they're better able to understand where both parties are coming from. And it also fosters discussion about other things like dealing with the sense of loss. So I mentioned that grief can be something that's associated with signs potentially of depression, a sense of hopelessness, flat affect, etc. So what this study did was really novel. They identified family members of program participants, and they identified family members of individuals who were equivalently ill and died but were not program participants, with the explicit goal of evaluating psychological responses to death. And so in the graph here, what you have is a wide variety of mental health outcomes. So current level of depression, prolonged grief disorder, Beck depression score, that's a very common way of assessing depression symptoms, social support, and then healthcare usage. And so this is for the family members who had a loved one participate in an aid in dying program. And this is the data for the comparison family members. Lots of numbers. The primary thing we want to look at is this here is when you do the statistical analysis and look at the difference between the two groups, there is no difference. So there was no increase in negative psychological reaction of family members when they had a loved one participating in an aid in dying program. The other thing that the researchers noted was that program participants reported, family members of program participants reported being significantly more likely to have had discussions wherein the loved one was able to say goodbye. And they also reported significant increases in their level of acceptance associated with the death, and they reported feeling significantly more prepared for the death when it actually did happen. And so what the research evidence fairly conclusively shows is that there is no increased risk for experiencing death associated with participation in an aid in dying program. And in some ways, it actually facilitates the transition process. So sorry for that little data blitz there. I feel like mine was much less interesting than the cool pictures that we saw earlier, right? But in conclusion, the data generally suggests that some of the concerns about legalization of medical aid in dying programs are relatively unfounded. And I didn't show you data for it, but I just want to mention it here, that looking at patient experiences, program participants overall generally report a higher quality of death, as noted by family members, caregivers, physicians, and the individuals as they get close to end of life, relative to individuals who report not participating in it. And then, like I just discussed, right, family members of program participants appear to be more well prepared, more accepting, and no more susceptible, and in many cases, somewhat less susceptible to experiencing some of the negative consequences associated with the loss of a loved one. Okay, lots of references.
How's everyone doing? Good? It starts getting dark, and then I start going, oh. It's the light. Okay. All right, so I'm a communication professor. I really am interested in language, and I'm interested in messages. So I'm going to try to focus my talk on some of those things and think about the ways in which we talk about things like grief and mourning and continuing bonds. So I'm going to start by talking about metaphors. One of the things that Susan Sontag says is that we can't think without metaphors, right? She says they offer clues for how we orient towards particular topics. So one metaphor or one way of talking about grief that we often hear is you're just going to get over it. You need to get over it, right? Why can't they get over it? As if, this is not me in my youth or anything. I don't know who this person is. Never hurdled in my life. But like as if it's just a hurdle, right? Somebody dies and then we're gonna get over it, right? Or you should. Another one is that grief is something that you go through, and I'm not going to keep this up very long because I'm worried about it. But as like grief, one of the things that I learned, and I'm going to go to a blank slide now. I don't want anybody to have seizures. One of the things that I learned early on when I was a very new graduate student was I sat down with a chaplain, and chaplains are like some of the most amazing people. And he said, people say things like you need to get over a loss or a death. He says, but you don't get over it. You go through it. And you have to go through a grieving process. So I think that type of language is particularly important. One of the challenges, and I think with some of that kind of getting over language, is that it suggests that grief is a process that ends, that it has an end point, right? So a metaphor that I think is a little bit better is one about waves. And the way that the same chaplain kind of described it to me is that, you walk along the beach, and like the water's like tickling your toes, and you can handle that. That's the type of grief that you can manage, right? But it's always kind of there, yeah? But maybe it's really more accurate, something like this, right? And this idea that it speaks to, some days it's going to be tickling your toes, but other days it's going to knock you over when you least expect it, right? And so these two metaphors, I think, are a little bit better. It suggests that grief is manageable, that you're always going to have it, but that it's natural, right? The ocean is something that's natural, and it's perpetual, okay? So I think, again, though, this particular model, or this particular way of thinking about and languaging grief, though, still gets us to that kind of stages idea, and that there's maybe a potential for a resolution or an end point, okay? So one other possibility is something like this, okay? So we're going to keep that nature metaphor going for a little bit longer, and I found this picture. You'd be amazed how many objects there are that trees are growing around them. When you do a Google search, you should do it sometime when you're bored. Here's another one of a gravestone. I thought that was appropriate. Just tree just growing right there, right? So one of the reasons why I'm introducing this particular model is this is a growing around grief. Right, and it comes from, at least where I found it, was from this woman named Lois Tonkin. She was at a workshop with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who's very famous for her work about dying and death, and eventually her influence on grief. And the woman said, she drew this particular type of image. She said that blue dot was the grief that she experienced after the death of her child, right? And she said that I thought that what would happen was that it would eventually just get smaller, right? Like this one on the right. And that her life would kind of continue on, but the grief it wouldn't be so massive, right? She says, I thought that it would eventually get smaller and smaller and shrink down. What she found was that really the grief, this is actually the same size circle, okay? That the grief was actually the exact same in many ways, right? But that she was eventually able to have her life kind of circle around it, like some of the elements of life that could continue on and that she was able to experience. And so she said that life was able to happen on in this kind of larger scale, but that grief was always there. And I think what this really suggests is that people, when they experience a death, they don't want to forget. That is their big concern. This is what you see in a film like Coco, right? That there's a major concern about forgetting a loved one, right? What does it mean if we forget a loved one? And I think that what some of these other models, these newer models, suggest is that you don't have to, right? You don't have to forget the loved one, and you won't, even if you could, right? Because they're always going to be there, okay? So I think this also leads us to thinking about this concept of continuing bonds, and I'm going to talk about a little bit more here in a second, right? That there's a continuation, that it's going to carry on, okay? So I think this idea that grief then leads into some other concept that we talked about in the beginning, which is about mourning, right? What are the mourning practices that we engage in, those public displays of this internal psychological process that we're going through? So I want to just go through some quick examples, and if you've been to some of the other afterlives sessions, you may have seen some of these. So what is the kind of materiality, the tangible elements of mourning that we might see out in our culture? Victorian hair work is one, and it's called Victorian hair work. I know a woman that actually does this today, like a young woman that actually does this, that was not alive during Victorian times. But people would take the hair of the deceased loved one and turn it into jewelry and wear it on their person, and they would have displays in their homes and that type of thing. So here's one example of that. Funeral photography. A lot of people know about the Wisconsin death trip. But this particular piece is from the Harlem Book of the Dead, and it features African Americans who use funeral photography. And I hope you're seeing some maybe similarities between contemporary things that you might see, because we're going to talk about those shortly. But you can see how they even do things like superimpose images, other images into the photograph where they have the actual person's corpse there. But people would display these in their homes. Sometimes people would actually take photographs with a body. Okay. Another one, a more contemporary one, is the Names Project. This is the AIDS quilt that was in Washington, D.C. It's like one of those, people were making panels in honor of a loved one. I think this must have been an early photograph, because my understanding is that it covered the whole National Mall. So this is just one section. So lots of panels of people who died because of AIDS. Maybe you've seen the Rest in Peace, RIP shirts. These were really popular when I was in high school. You would see people that would have them made. Sometimes they would take their own adhesive letters and have a message to a loved one. You sometimes see them on people's decals on people's cars. This one was just from some random website I found. So RIP Auntie Linda. Touched by my angel, so you have the person's name there. And I think some of these, this is an interesting one because it's something that you can wear anytime, right? You don't have to necessarily don it for a memorial service or a funeral, but you can always do it. I have my own kind of materiality. I wear a ring almost every day that has a stone in it. That was, my grandmother used to do things like make jewelry, and she made a piece of jewelry. And one of the things that I tell people about it, and I think of it as like a means of communication, is that when people compliment me on the ring, then it gives me a chance to talk about my grandmother. It gives me a chance to talk about the influence that she had on my life. She was an educator herself. She was born in 1920, the year women had the right to vote, got the right to vote, and she had aspirations to be not a teacher, but to be a nurse, to do other things, right? So it helps me talk about her and her influence on my life. Right, so I think the other thing about some of these images that I'm going to go, the next one I'll show you, I think leads to this, is a second line jazz funeral, right? And these are common in New Orleans. And I picked this one in particular, this example in particular, because I think it's important to think about the ways in which and I think this is what Dr. Mena was alluding to too a little bit earlier, was that sometimes this feels foreign to us because it's not our practice. But what we really find is that sometimes something like a New Orleans second line jazz funeral is a type of act of resistance in marginalized communities. So what happens in a place like New Orleans is that people literally take over the streets, right? And they start flooding out into the streets, sometimes not necessarily for a famous musician or an artist, but sometimes it's for a member of the community. And they chart the territory that they will take a route that also stops in particular places that were meaningful to the person. And so I think to be thinking about the ways in which these material practices of mourning are a way of having some agency, having voice, are particular types of acts of resistance too are particularly important. Okay, I want to talk about some really contemporary things because I have some. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. I'm kind of a Luddite about technology. I use it, but I'm very, very suspicious about it. Very suspicious about it, and I'm going to talk about why. So this kind of leads me to mourning and this concept of continuing bonds. Now, I want to show you a kid's book that I bring children's books to my end of life class, and we look at how authors are talking about the issues of dying and loss and grief. And this one is an example of continuing bonds that you will see. It talks about an invisible string that is connected between you and your loved ones, and how you always have that connection, right? So even in children's books, we're seeing this concept of continuing bonds as a way to comfort people. But way back, does anybody still have a MySpace page or remember MySpace? MySpace was like the first Facebook, really, right? The first kind of social media site. And what happened as people who had MySpace pages died is that people would go to the page and like be posting, pictures, messages, that type of thing. But I guess MySpace started feeling like that was some type of problem. So they converted pages of people who had died from MySpace to mydeathspace.com. And I tried to look it up. I don't know, it doesn't look the same as it used to, right? But I remember a colleague of mine in graduate school talking about how valuable it was for her because she and her family would be able to go through her nephew's like MySpace page and look at some of his old posts and have memories about him. And even then I kind of thought like, oh, okay, that seems something about that felt odd to me, right? But again, to the point about like what feels familiar and what feels comfortable. So I have another example. There is a hyperlink in here if anybody wants to take a look at this, but I picked a particular Facebook page of one of my mentors, a former communication studies professor named Nick Trujillo, who I think would find it very amusing that I'm talking about him today about this topic and using his Facebook page as an example. But when he died rather unexpectedly of a heart attack, his Facebook page became a place where people went and started leaving messages, right? And especially I found out that he had died on Facebook, which I had just seen him a few weeks earlier, and I was disappointed that was the mechanism by which that information was communicated to me. And what has happened now is that Facebook now has a whole system for making legacy pages. So his page is still there. You can still tag him in posts, and you can still see old videos. Like all of the content is still there, right? And you can access it. So I'm going to show you a couple of messages, a couple of examples of continuing bonds from his particular page. So one of his really good friends on the left, Bob Krizek, who's also a professor of communication, or I think he might be retired now. He was talking about how he went to a game when he was in Japan. They used to play catch, but he was the catcher and Nick was a pitcher in college. So they used to play catch at conferences all the time, and they bring their glove and mitt. So he's making a reference to this activity that they used to do together. And then I don't know Bonnie Hodge, but she got, thanks to Facebook, a notification about when she and Nick became friends on Facebook, and that prompted her to then think about him and post a message. There were other posts on his page about how one person just out of the blue, not related to his birthday or the anniversary of his death, just said, I really miss you. I wish I could, I would love to be able to talk to you about where I am right now in my career and that type of thing. So people sharing messages where they're continuing kind of a conversation with a deceased loved one, somebody that they care about. Yeah? Okay, so here's where I start getting anxiety. Okay? Because Facebook, so this idea that Facebook and other social media sites, I have a student working with me, we've been looking at Instagram and Twitter and messages there as a mediator for grief and mourning. And the reason why this gives me anxiety is, yes, I feel like it gives a wonderful opportunity to have communication with other people, right? But I worry about, look at how many likes poor Bonnie's post got. Right? Because this is also part of how we evaluate and how we assess whether or not our message has been received by anybody. Yeah? Now, I don't think she has to have had likes to have had an experience necessarily, but I'm worried about whether or not this allows for a type of communal experience, a type of coming together, a type of social support that people often need when they are experiencing grief. Does it allow that? Does it really foster that kind of thing? Did anybody pick up the phone and call Bonnie? Did anybody pick up the phone and call Bob and say, how are you doing today? You are thinking about somebody that you care about, right? I loved it. That's my little love there, just so Bob knows, right? But I didn't pick up the phone and call him. I didn't pick up and check on him, right? And I think this is a major concern that I have about how we approach and how we think about the role of technology. It is not that technology is bad or evil, right? One of my professors used to say it both enables and constrains. So I want to think about the ways in which it constrains for a moment, because I think we can recognize the value, right? Okay, so thinking about Facebook and other social media as a mediator. And I think that one of the things where this is headed is that, yes, we can use these mechanisms as a way to continue bonds, right? You can tag your loved one in a post. You can talk about your loved one in this space. You kind of have this kind of digital diary kind of experience maybe. But we are seeing the artificial intelligence enter into our grief experience and our mourning experience. So Black Mirror, if any of you have seen Black Mirror, one of the episodes in particular called Be Right Back, which a person is like essentially reconstituted in a form, and they use artificial intelligence so that now you can interact with the deceased loved one, right? Well, this is a reality. It is happening, right? So there is somebody that created a program based upon her loved one, a friend's messages and responses, and created artificial intelligence, right? There is a man who created a program for his children called Grief Bots, right? And he says they'll respond. This is a Daily Beast article. He says they will respond when prompted, imitating the deceased's cadence, tone, and idiosyncrasies. And this creator, a man named Ahmad, thinks that these grief bots make grieving for loved ones an interactive experience. An interactive experience, right? And I think it's one thing to live on in someone's memories, which is what continuing bonds kind of argues, is that you use the memories to maintain a relationship. And so it's one thing for those memories to live on, right? For us to feel like we have those continuing bonds, but I think it's an entirely different matter when we interact with an avatar, right? And if we are interacting with the avatar as a substitute, then I guess maybe that is what our ultimate goal is to render death null, like it doesn't exist anymore, because once that physical body is gone, you can just maintain the interaction with the artificial intelligence, right? I think the other thing, and I'm going to pull on some theorists here, is that Derrida in his book, The Work of Mourning, talks about relationship as it relates to the work of mourning, right? And he asks the question, like, what are we mourning exactly? Are we mourning the person who has most immediately left, who has most immediately died, or that we've lost? Or so is it the person that's directly in front of us, or are we potentially mourning the others? Because what a lot of people argue is that we just have an accumulation of losses that we are actually processing every time there is a new loss. We're still working out the old losses, right? Because as we know, it's always there. Those losses are always there, right? And Judith Butler says, when she's talking about issues of mourning and grief, she really says, we should be paying attention to our responses as a type of reflexive exercise, right? That asks us to question, who am I in the face of this loss? That's part of what that mother was experiencing, right? Who am I in the face of this loss? We are undone, she says, by our relationship with others. And she says, we need the community to help us in that process to make sense of what we're going through, right? So I have a lot of concern about the possibility of something like technology really taking over the grieving experience. I want to see us come together, and I want us to take this information about the posts, the messages that we're hearing and that we're sharing with each other as a mechanism for us to say to each other, hey, what do you need? How can we come together? How can I help you with this process, right? As opposed to trying to do this in isolation from behind a screen.
Yeah, so for Rebekah, the point that in a consequentialist perspective, it doesn't seem like there's much wrong with the dignity and dying thing, but would you not agree that the objection is more of an a priori one, a more fundamental one, spiritual or religious objections to ending life before God intended or something like that?
But yes, I think there are a lot of people that would argue from a religious perspective, but not everybody adheres to that religious doctrine. And in a country that has separation of church and state, what should be driving the policy?
No, I'm just saying from a psychological perspective, I feel like the other side they're not really arguing from a consequentialist point of view, right?
So I can tell you what the data shows, that people who are strongly identified as religious are significantly less likely to participate in the program. So individual religiosity is a variable that affects seeking out the services. But for people that don't adhere to those types of religious doctrine, it's sort of an irrelevant argument.
Of course.
But yeah, no, thanks for bringing that. I had meant to mention something about religion as a demographic characteristic, but yeah, thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, this is addressed primarily to Dr. Mena, but includes all of you. Like this new materiality, this anime or whatever it is, it seems to me it's part of humanity in this sense, right? Human beings are so tied up with tool making, and I would say instrumentality. Ever since we made the first tools, we transformed the material into an animate object in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this affects the world, but it also affects us.
Mm-hmm.
And so this brings us to the contemporary situation. We're so bound up in this relationship that I don't know whether we could break it, it's gone faster and it's more powerful, but we have a kind of almost a compelling relationship, and the tools that we made have, in a sense, made us not only transform society, but it actually transformed us in that relationship. And I do understand this thing about maintaining our humanity within this thing, but on the other hand, we're so intimately tied up with it, and it's like that in some ways is the distinction between us and animals, although some animals do make tools, but not to the degree that we make it. So I'm more concerned about that relationship to life rather than to death, because we are constantly being transformed in life.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you. I think, part of the new materialist thought development is really about restructuring how we talk about things. And so I do think, I think you're absolutely right, but I don't think we often conceive of or talk about inanimate objects or non-human matter in the way that you just did. And so part of what I wanted to do was think about how contemporary practices that might be sort of thought of as, again, strange or foreign, actually, and then particularly thought of as strange and foreign from a sort of dominant religious perspective in this part of the world, that being Christianity. to show that, for some ancient Christians, this sort of idea of the material, and the way that you put it, how it affects us, how it changes us, and in particular when talking about material matter that belongs to another human being that is no longer present in this world. I mean, absolutely. I just don't think that we really talk about it in that same way. We do sometimes. I think when we talk about death and loved ones passing, Dr. Tullis's example of the ring is a perfect, way of demonstrating, that this ring is affecting her. It has an effect on her. She talked about it as giving her an opportunity to talk about her grandmother, but the fact is she wears it and puts it on, it actually changes the way she moves through the world because of those kinds of experiences in which she gets to remember her grandmother and talk about her in that way. But again, I think you're pointing to something that is, yes, I again agree. I just don't think we talk about non-human matter that way, and I think reorienting how we talk about it and even conceive of it actually changes the way we treat it, or treat other humans for that matter.
You all did such a great job. Thank you. It was really terrific to hear, because I know that this is such a big part of one of your research. I think that this question is for both Dr. Mena and Dr. Tullis, that both came up, and this is sort of follows up on Phil's question. I was thinking of the philosopher David Chalmers on panpsychism. So I just finished teaching a section on quantum physics and consciousness, and I was thinking of this idea that even inanimate matter can have some even minute amount of consciousness, that electrons, they're talking about the possibility, because if consciousness is something that we want to talk about in a non-material way, we might have to talk about it as having something to do with everything in existence and in some way. And so, just this, obviously you both touched on the cyborg issue, which I find really interesting, just because there's so much that's being done. The Black Mirror episode is a great example, and then of course Westworld, and there's just so many examples of what's coming, of this idea of where consciousness is, and if we're talking about this sort of blurring between the planes of existence, it seems like this might be kind of an interesting, I was interested in the anima stuff, but I think that this is another way to kind of go about it. It's just kind of curious what you thought of.
I mean, it's coming. It's definitely a topic I think we're going to be confronting, or at least we're being. Some media representations are asking us to think about those things. I mean, even the San Junipero episode of Black Mirror, which is lauded as being this wonderful. Oh, it's a flip on the whole Black Mirror script that is so down and depressing. I think that's horribly depressing. Yeah. I don't want to give it away for anybody who hasn't seen it, but to think of like consciousness being trapped in, Right. I mean, I think that there's something. Yeah, I think there's something that it speaks to, at least in the context of dying and death. Like, again, it's something about our inability to just accept that perhaps death is the end. I don't know if I could say that more bleakly, but I mean, I think that, I think there's an interesting question there, and it comes back, some of those topics come back to that for me, that what if it is over at the point at which a human body ceases to breathe, and, I think that's a question that people haven't necessarily attended to.
I was wondering, when I was hearing you speak, if you think that, so I'm picking up that you have a bit of an aversion to some of these newer practices.
Sometimes, yes.
But I wonder to what extent I'm trying to think of how to frame this, but is it that there is a sort of replacement of a kind of relationality that might happen if the AI were not created to be whatever it is? Or is it that people recognize there is still a lack, there is still a death, there is still a loss, but that this approximation to a memory or approximation to a reality, artificial as it must be, and certainly, what were they called? Cyborg I was going to say pups, not pups. What were they? The little bots.
The grief bots?
Yeah, I don't know why I'm imagining them as little tiny.
If they were puppies, I might be okay with it.
I'm not sure why. In my mind, as you described them, I just imagine them as little things. But these grief bots, that do they, for whoever uses them? I mean, is the idea that this is a kind of replacement that people won't recognize is artificial, or is it that this is just where our culture is now moving towards, where this provides some kind of comfort, unreal as it may be? I don't know.
I mean, I think I'm probably concerned about both of those things, right? I'm always concerned about the idea that technology can somehow solve our biggest issues and problems. So that's one element. But I think, this idea that somebody can be an approximation of, I think that's where the failing, that's what you see in the Black Mirror episode, at least Be Right Back, is that the person is only an approximation. He is not the person that she wants and needs him to be. So that's where the technology fails. I suppose technology could get to the point where it's so good that you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, right? Yeah. I think it's also maybe you need to be able to have no gap. There was a gap in time where she's waiting for the guy to show up, right? So, I mean, I guess if you could do it without that gap, where you would have a seamless transition, you didn't know the person died, then I don't know. I mean, or that you didn't have the recognition of it. I don't know. I'm not sure. But I think I have anxiety about several of those things. Because I do think that part of what it does is it lets us off the hook. It lets those of us that are here in this moment off the hook, that we can just pass it off to the technology or to that we may actually be able to comfort each other, be in relationship with each other, commune together, and not solve the problem, but get through the experience.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you're saying, because I think people in general accept a certain amount of artificiality that they perceive as reality. And there's all of that research evidence showing that loneliness scores are off the charts, yet we're so socially connected on online formats. They're clearly not giving us exactly what we need. And so it could be that on the online processing of grief is a less than ideal substitute for actual social interaction.
Yeah, I mean, we are seeing those types of things happen too, where, we have Alzheimer's patients in a facility, we're gonna give them virtual reality. Well, why don't we have a system that allows people to go visit them? I mean, I don't understand why we're so willing to do that, right? When, if we know people are lonely, that we have mechanisms to work with loneliness, that aren't technological. So